Practicing in responsible ways. Working with other people may not always be as straightforward as it sounds, and we need to ensure we treat others with respect, particularly when it comes to being responsible in how we present, accountable for our actions, and always respecting the confidentiality of another person's information. Then there's also collaboration, which necessitates some degree of negotiation when it comes to the tricky area of agreeing challenging decisions regarding how we proceed with others in the support of others. Accountability is one of those scary words, at least for some. It can mean being blamed if your outlook and previous experience is deeply rooted in that of a blame culture. Well, can there be such a thing as collective accountability? Would that help us to shake off some of the baggage that we bring from that deep-rooted previous fear? Or is collective accountability merely an attempt to deflect the focus of attention away from individuals onto some vague, amorphous group? However you look at it, you are justifiably accountable for the decisions and the actions you take within the scope of your professional title or your job description. In taking on a particular job role, you should have considered the accountability that is rightfully attached to the position that you've accepted. And as such, you can't subsequently hand over that accountability or delegate it to others just because you want an easier life, avoiding any potential blame. On the other hand, others can't hold you accountable for information you didn't have, that was deliberately or otherwise withheld. The things you simply didn't know about at the time a decision went badly wrong. In these circumstances, you must be able to demonstrate that you did make all reasonable effort to acquire the necessary information that was out there. And that's why, if you remember back in Module 2, Working with Risk, I've deliberately built into the design of my risk tools a prompt for you to note down what information was available to you at the time that you were making a specific decision. Here are just a few useful questions to keep asking yourself, which may help you clarify your own accountability at the time of making a challenging decision. It would be useful at this point in time if you pause the presentation. Try and identify a current or a recent situation in which you're involved in a decision and apply this list of questions to that situation. As with most exercises and tools across this course, this list should form an aide-memoire, a checklist, something for you to draw on when it's needed. Then there is the issue of responsibility. One that I would say is slightly easier to see how it could be a collective shared activity, at least in some situations. Though, remember, we're all working in isolation on occasions, which still require us to make a quick decision. Individually, we remain responsible for what we do and say in the context of our role. For health and social care practitioners, this will largely revolve around your own therapeutic and supportive input with a person. Some individual practitioners may be responsible for the care or the support plan, as I am in my brain injury case management role most frequently. However, that care and support plan can also be seen as a collective responsibility with teams. That'll depend on how the functions of a particular team are set up. This is also a level where allocation of workload, supervision of people help to provide a context for the notion of shared responsibility. Senior management in higher organizational roles also share specific responsibilities. This is where the overall ethos and values of an organization may be set, and how this develops through policy statements, practice guidance, and also support mechanisms. Authoritarian cultures provide more of a top-down process of instruction with clearly delineated lines of accountability and responsibility. Ideally, everyone knows where they are and what's expected. However, these can also be settings where a blame culture thrives, where fear becomes a defining law of how transactions take place. Conversely, more open and supportive organizations are places where people are encouraged to take risks, but within a climate of knowledge sharing and collective responsibility. Far from being places where responsibility gets fudged, in my experience, people are more confident in their decision making, more open in their reasoning, making more defensible rather than defensive decisions. At this point, I'll ask you to read the PDF document in the resources entitled Accountability and Responsibility, and then reflect on how the two concepts relate to your current position. Another issue that is vitally important to take into account when we're thinking about working with people is confidentiality, which can be a significant issue, even a block in the ability of some people to constructively work with people. Sometimes it might be an artificial barrier created by some practitioners just because it's easier. They'll say, I can't do that because of confidentiality, that type of statement, rather than taking on what could be more challenging discussions. But used appropriately, it can engage trust in working relationships. It will require much more openness regarding what we're sharing, with whom. Who are we sharing this information with, and why? In my experience, it tends to become more of an issue where secrecy is involved, whether that's real or perceived on the other person's behalf. But if they do perceive that some level of secrecy is going on, quite often that's where the concerns about confidentiality tend to be more frequently raised as issues. Having said that, it's also necessary to be explicit about those occasions, rare events when we can and should breach confidentiality, where recognized patterns of previous behaviors are developing, or perhaps where new patterns of a very clear risk are observed. Then breaching confidentiality, particularly where there are known likely victims and these can be identified, perhaps they've even already been named, and where discussions are bringing about no change at all to the intended actions or behaviours, or even discussions result in a complete rejection by a person of the viewpoints of others. In all of these situations, there could be an immediate need to at least inform the known potential victims. This could be the minimum of action so that they can take their own appropriate action to prevent or minimize any of the potentially dangerous consequences. And that's the absolute minimum. But depending on the circumstances, we may indeed have to take much more preventative action, much more restrictive action. Confidentiality tends to be more of an issue when the need to know and to whom it applies have not been openly discussed. I want to emphasize that point because if it's left open to people's interpretation, in these circumstances, Many people will tend towards perhaps the more fearful perception that the information about them is going to be broadcast on a much more wide-ranging basis. Here's an image that says just between me and you, but yeah, just the two of them at that kind of altitude, hurtling towards the ground. They can be having their conversation far less likely to be overheard by anybody else. Perhaps this is the ultimate in confidentiality. Perhaps it is, but only until they land. I'm just giving you an image of two people together, but the more we involve, then confidentiality becomes a bigger concern, a bigger issue, a much bigger issue to be acknowledged and discussed. The whole idea, working with people, is not just about engaging an individual. It often involves others. So confidentiality and how to treat it and best manage it needs to be uppermost in our minds. Negotiation is one of the main functions supporting how we work with other people, whether that's one-to-one with our clients, our patients, our service users, our students, depending on your area of work. However, negotiation is also at the heart of good teamwork, remembering that working with people frequently involves teams. Either you're part of a named team or we come together contributing our specific skills to a group of people assembled for a purpose and or for a particular timescale. Let me share a few thoughts here about keys to negotiation. Firstly, identifying the key players. Who has a genuine role to play in this particular risk decision, in this particular risk decision-making process? At this point in time, who should be involved? Who are the key players with an understanding of the situation? Who can contribute constructively to the discussion? Who brings the knowledge? Are we all open to listening to the understanding that different people might bring to the situation? That situation where we're trying to make a decision about. Is there scope for compromise, particularly where there'll be differences of opinion? And when we're talking about positive risk-taking decisions, mark my word, there will be differences of opinion. It requires quite a degree of skill to sometimes try and bring those different opinions together, ultimately into some kind of consensus. Knowing when not to take the risk. Just because we call something positive risk-taking doesn't mean we always take the risk. It's knowing when not to in very particular situations as well. And that goes back to occasionally seeing where the risk outweighs the benefits, where it outweighs the potential outcome, those positive outcomes. And then how will decisions finally be arrived at in this negotiation? Do we have a clearly articulated protocol? It's all well and good when we can agree and ultimately come together in some kind of consensus, but what about when we can't? How do we manage those differences? Who ultimately makes that decision? Is this how negotiation happens in action? Here's a good depiction of how not to negotiate, and I'm sure this image will reflect the experiences of some of you. Personally, I can instantly reflect on a few people who will remain nameless who embodied this particular style. And I'd have to say, it never encouraged or developed me in any constructive way at all. So the whole idea of empowering processes and negotiation, of working with people, requires this thing called perseverance. And Henry Ford sums it up quite well here. As a process, coming together as a beginning, keeping together as is progress, and working together as success. I kind of like how that quote sets out developmental stages of togetherness in action. It doesn't happen instantly, and it will have benefits and challenges. The process is never straightforward and simple. It will present us with a need to weigh up the benefits and the challenges in each situation. Just as in that definition of positive risk taking I set out in Module 1, we've got to weigh up the pros and the cons of different options when we're making a decision. Here we've got some benefits and some challenges. Involving people in assessing their own needs and potential solutions makes the risk management processes more transparent and honest. There's the benefit: transparency, honesty, which themselves will help to promote better engagement. But the flip side of that, risk and control may mitigate against this person-centered, this relationship-centered approach. Examples being that there could be conflicting ways in which different practitioners use or even understand things like the Mental Capacity Act or processes of safeguarding when people are deemed to be at risk. Once again, I'll invite you to go back and read one of the resources associated with this module, the document Accountability and Responsibility. It might also be useful to read over the edited transcript for this particular presentation. How are the ideas of accountability and responsibility articulated in your experience? Whether that's in the form of written policy or in the ways it seems to play out when decisions are actually being made. Are there any gaps in relation to your reflections on the messages that I've been presenting here? And if there are, how may those gaps be addressed in the local context in which you're working?